The engine at the corner where Widow's Pass Road met the county highway had been running for 11 minutes when Gordon Blackwell finally admitted his Range Rover wasn't going anywhere. The gate ahead of him was steel, powder-coated forest green to match the pine trees the county required, and closed with a padlock the size of a fist. Behind the gate, the road climbed 900 vertical feet in a series of switchbacks toward a house he had paid $2.4 million for 4 months earlier. A house he could see from where he sat, chimney smoke curling into a sky the color of a bruise, close enough to touch and completely unreachable. Taped to his windshield, tucked under the wiper blade like a parking ticket outside a downtown bar, was a single sheet of paper. Timberline Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead. Violation notice. Section 7.3. Obstruction of common access. $500 a day. Retroactive. Addressed to Daniel Whitfield of 118 Widow's Pass Road, the man who owned the gate, the road, and, as it would turn out in a Larimer County courtroom 11 weeks later, most of the argument. The irony was that Gordon Blackwell had signed that violation notice himself. He was, after all, the president of the association issuing it. He had simply not counted on the man he was fining being the only person in Ashford Peak, Colorado, holding a locked gate between Gordon and his own driveway. Daniel Whitfield watched all of this from his porch, through a pair of Steiner binoculars he'd owned since a stint doing dam inspections for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he did not go down to explain himself. He'd learned that lesson already, the expensive way, over the preceding 11 months. Some men only understand a locked gate. So Daniel had decided, calmly and with the same structural precision he'd once used to certify bridge load limits, to give Gordon Blackwell exactly that. Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many are watching from behind enemy lines right now. To understand how a retired structural engineer ended up holding a mountain hostage from a fold-out chair on his own porch, you have to go back almost a full year, to a Tuesday in March, when Ashford Peak, Colorado, was still just a town of 4,000 people, a defunct silver mine, a 2-block Main Street with one hardware store and one diner that closed at 3, and one very old road that nobody in the county had thought twice about in decades. Ashford Peak sits at 8,200 feet, tucked into a fold of the Front Range where the highway narrows to 2 lanes, and cell service gets unreliable past the second switchback. It's the kind of town real estate listings describe as a hidden gem, which mostly means the winters are long and the property taxes are lower than they should be for the views. Timberline Ridge Estates, the subdivision at the base of the mountain, was carved out of an old cattle ranch in 1998 by a developer named Colson Brothers Land Company. 40 single-family lots laid out along 3 cul-de-sacs, Ptarmigan Court, Elk Meadow Drive, and Aspen Hollow Lane, with underground utilities, a shared storm drainage system, a community mailbox kiosk shaped like a miniature barn, and a homeowners association governed by a declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, recorded with the Larimer County Clerk and Recorder on September the 9th of that year. It was, by the standards of mountain town HOAs, a mild one. Dues were $320 a year. The Architectural Review Committee mostly concerned itself with paint colors and whether a shed's roofline matched the approved palette. Every 4th of July there was a potluck at the clubhouse that ran until somebody's dog got into the potato salad. And every October there was a chili cook-off that 3 different households had, at various points, insisted they'd won unfairly. Widow's Pass Road wasn't part of any of that. It predated the subdivision by 60 years, hand-cut in the 1930s, by miners servicing a scatter of silver claims higher up the ridge, a narrow gravel track that switchbacked its way up through aspen groves and outcrops of exposed granite before leveling off into 5 parcels, lots 10 through 14, that Colson brothers had carved out separately when they platted the ranch in 1998 and sold as mountain estate parcels, each 5 acres or more, each sitting outside the boundary of the platted subdivision below, each accessible by nothing but that same mining road. The road itself had its own legal history, older than the subdivision, older than the HOA, recorded in Book 412, page 88 of the Larimer County Real Property Records, back in 1987. That agreement, the Widows Pass Road Maintenance and Access Easement Agreement, did 3 specific things, and Daniel Whitfield had read every word of it twice before he ever put in an offer on the property it governed. It granted fee title to the roadbed itself, not merely an easement, but actual ownership of the dirt and gravel and the culverts running beneath it, to whoever owned what was then called the Whitfield Placer Claim, later renamed Lot 41. It granted the owners of lots 10 through 14 a perpetual, non-exclusive easement of ingress and egress over that road, guaranteeing them the right to use it forever, gate or no gate. And it named the Lot 41 owner the Road Steward, a title that came with real obligations: maintenance, snow removal, keeping the culverts clear, and one real power: the authority to install, maintain, and lock a gate for purposes of security, wildfire mitigation, and controlling heavy equipment traffic that might damage a roadbed built for mule teams and half-ton pickups, subject only to a 24-hour advance notice requirement to the other easement holders for anything over 10,000 pounds, and a guarantee of emergency vehicle access at all times, lock or no lock. Daniel Whitfield bought Lot 41, a solid, unglamorous A-frame he'd named Half Moon Ridge for the curve of granite behind it, in 2013, 3 years before he retired from 31 years as a licensed structural engineer, the last 11 of those spent inspecting highway bridges and dam spillways for the Colorado Department of Transportation. He was 58 years old that March, widowed 6 years by then. His wife, Carol, had died of ovarian cancer in a hospital in Fort Collins on a Sunday morning in October, and he still, some evenings, set 2 coffee cups out of habit before catching himself. He had one daughter, Rebecca, 29, living in Denver with a job doing environmental permitting for a civil engineering firm, and a habit of calling every Sunday evening whether or not there was news to report. He kept a certified copy of the 1987 agreement in a fireproof lockbox in his mudroom, right next to the original deed, right next to Carol's death certificate and the title to a 2009 Ford pickup he'd never bothered to sell. He was, in short, exactly the wrong kind of homeowner for anyone to try to bluff, and exactly the kind of neighbor most people in Timberline Ridge liked without knowing much about. The man who plowed the shared section of the road before the county contractor even showed up, who'd fixed Priya Nair's mailbox post after a windstorm without being asked, who came to precisely one HOA meeting a year, the annual one, voted, and left. For 8 years, Widows Pass Road had been almost aggressively uneventful. The 5 upper households, Daniel at Lot 41 down at the gate, the Osei family, Kwame and Abena and their 2 kids, at Lot 12, the Farabaus, a retired schoolteacher couple, Jim and Linda at Lot 13, a rental property at Lot 11 that changed hands every few years and mostly sat empty in winter, and, until the March in question, an elderly widower named Franklin Yates at Lot 14, the highest parcel on the ridge, had settled into a rhythm nobody had ever written down because nobody had needed to. You called ahead if you had a delivery bigger than a UPS van. You didn't block the gate. You waved at Daniel when you passed his porch because he was always on it, and he waved back. Franklin Yates sold Falcon's Nest, the sprawling contemporary at the very top of the ridge, in late February, after his children convinced him assisted living in Fort Collins made more sense than another Rocky Mountain winter alone. The house itself was striking. 4 bedrooms, a wine cellar blasted into the granite bedrock, floor-to-ceiling glass on the west face, looking out at three 14,000-foot peaks that turned gold at sunset in a way that made first-time visitors stop talking mid-sentence. It went on the market on a Thursday and had 4 offers by the following Monday. Gordon Blackwell's was the highest, at $2,400,000, and it closed, with unusual speed for a mountain property, on March the 4th. Gordon was 51, built like a man who'd once played college football and never quite let the frame go soft, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 22 years running a chain of 6 regional auto dealerships across northern Colorado before selling the whole operation to a private equity group 2 years earlier for what local business gossip put somewhere north of $11 million. He had a wife, Melissa, who'd been a regional sales manager at one of his own dealerships before they married, and 2 teenage sons, Tyler and Brett, 16 and 14, who arrived at Ashford Peak High School mid-semester with dirt bikes strapped to a trailer and a general air of having been promised this move would be an upgrade. His real estate agent, a young, ambitious woman named Court Ferris, who'd only been selling in the Ashford Peak market for 2 years, mentioned the access situation almost as an afterthought during the walkthrough. That the road up was private, gravel, maintained, and gated by a neighbor at the bottom, governed by some older paperwork she hadn't personally reviewed in detail. Gordon, who had spent 2 decades negotiating floor plan financing agreements with manufacturers and knew, or believed he knew, how to read a contract, waved it off. A gate at the bottom of a road he now held an easement over seemed like exactly the kind of formality you renegotiated once you were established, the way he'd renegotiated better terms with every manufacturer rep who'd ever tried to hold a hard line with him. He did not, notably, have his own attorney review the 1987 agreement before closing. He had Ellis Draper, the business litigator who'd handled every dealership franchise dispute Gordon had ever had, glance at the closing documents in a 15-minute call, and Draper, who did commercial contract litigation and had never in his career touched a mining-era easement, told Gordon it looked standard. Gordon closed on Falcon's Nest on March the 4th. He moved his family in over the following 6 weeks, along with, almost immediately, a great deal of construction equipment, because the wine cellar wasn't enough, and the 4 bedrooms weren't enough, and within a month of closing, Gordon had already hired a Fort Collins contractor to begin an ambitious renovation that included, among other things, a home elevator to the wine cellar level, a redesigned primary suite with a freestanding soaking tub imported from Italy, and, though this detail wouldn't surface publicly for months, preliminary permitting inquiries about a private helicopter landing pad on the flattest section of the property, the kind of amenity Gordon had seen at a business associate's ranch outside Steamboat Springs, and had wanted, in the particular way Gordon wanted things, ever since. That was where the trouble started. Not with malice, exactly, at first, with the specific, expensive assumption that a road is a road, and a gate is a formality, and a neighbor with a fireproof lockbox full of 8-year-old paperwork was something you could simply outspend. Now that you know Daniel, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has done. The first violation of the 1987 agreement happened on April the 17th, a Wednesday, at 6:52 in the morning, when Daniel woke to the sound of an air brake releasing outside his bedroom window. He came out onto the porch in his robe, coffee not yet made, to find a 40-ton crane truck idling at his gate, which at that point he still left unlocked during daylight hours as a courtesy, the way he had for 8 years, with a flatbed trailer behind it, carrying a hot tub still in its shrink wrap, a bundle of structural steel I-beam, and what he'd later learn was a partially assembled home elevator shaft destined for Falcon's Nest. No one had called him. No one had given the 24-hour notice the 1987 agreement required for any vehicle over 10,000 pounds. The crane truck alone weighed close to 68,000 pounds fully loaded, more than 6 times the threshold, on a road engineered in the 1930s for mule teams and, decades later, half-ton pickup trucks, with a single culvert crossing at mile marker 0.6 that Daniel himself had inspected and reinforced only 3 years earlier, at his own expense, specifically because he understood, better than almost anyone in the county, what happens to an undersized culvert under an unexpected load. Daniel flagged the driver down. He introduced himself, calmly, as the road steward under the recorded easement agreement, and asked, politely, whether the crew could hold at the gate for 20 minutes while he walked the route and confirmed the culvert crossing could bear the weight. The driver, a subcontractor out of Fort Collins named Rios, who had absolutely no idea any of this was a legal dispute waiting to happen, said he was just following the work order from the homeowner up top. Daniel called up to Falcon's Nest on the number Court Ferris had given him during a neighborly introduction weeks earlier. Gordon Blackwell, in a bathrobe of his own, drove down the hill in a golf cart to see what the holdup was. "It's my road too," Gordon said, standing in Daniel's gravel driveway in slippers, arms already crossed. "I've got an easement." I looked it up. "Perpetual easement, yes," Daniel said. "Not unlimited weight, though. There's a notice requirement. Anything over 10,000 pounds needs 24 hours so I can check the culvert first. That truck's at 68,000. I'm not trying to slow your morning down, Mr. Blackwell. I'm trying to keep the crossing from failing under a load it was never built for." "I paid $2.4 million for that house," Gordon said, as though the number itself were an argument. "I think I can get a delivery truck up my own driveway." "It's not your driveway until it's past my gate," Daniel said, without heat, the way he might have once told a bridge contractor that a beam spec didn't meet code. "And even after that, it's still governed by the same agreement. I'm happy to show you the document if you haven't seen it." Gordon hadn't seen it. He told the driver to proceed anyway. Daniel, watching 31 years of load-bearing math flash behind his eyes, stepped in front of the truck's grill and did not move until Gordon, red-faced now, called Rios off and got his contractor on the phone to reschedule. It took 40 minutes total, standing in the cold, before the crane truck backed carefully down to the highway turnaround and left. Gordon did not thank Daniel. He got back in the golf cart and drove up the mountain without another word, which Daniel, at the time, chalked up to an inconvenienced man having a bad morning rather than the opening move of anything larger. The culvert survived that day. It did not survive the following Tuesday, when a different crew, subcontracted separately, apparently with no knowledge of the prior week's standoff, brought an even heavier concrete mixer truck up the road to pour the elevator shaft's footing and cracked the culvert's headwall clean through under the load. Daniel heard the crack from his porch, an ugly structural sound he recognized instantly from 31 years of listening for exactly that kind of failure. He documented it with photographs, time-stamped, the way he'd once documented failing highway infrastructure for the state, and got an emergency repair quote from a local contractor of $4,100. He mailed the invoice to Gordon Blackwell with a copy of the relevant clause of the 1987 agreement, the one assigning repair costs to whichever party's contractor caused the damage, highlighted in yellow, along with a brief, courteous cover letter. Gordon did not pay it. Gordon, instead, over the following month, quietly began building support for a run at the presidency of the Timberline Ridge Homeowners Association, an organization he had shown no prior interest in whatsoever, campaigning on a platform of modernizing shared infrastructure and fixing what he described, in a mailer sent to all 45 eligible households, as decades-old bottlenecks holding this community back. It should be said, at this point, that Widows Pass Road and Lot 41 and Lots 10 through 14 were not technically part of the platted Timberline Ridge subdivision at all. But in 2003, a prior owner of Lot 41, Daniel's predecessor, a retired forest ranger named Walt Kessler, had signed a narrow, voluntary annexation agreement bringing the 5 mountain parcels into the HOA for limited purposes. Shared snow removal contracting on the county road at the base of the mountain, and access to the association's group insurance rates, which were considerably cheaper than anything the 5 isolated households could get on their own. That agreement, recorded in Book 1140, page 233, was narrow by design. It authorized the association to collect a modest annual due of $320 from the 5 upper parcels, matching what the platted lots paid, and to enforce architectural review standards on any structure visible from the subdivision below. It said nothing whatsoever about governance of Widows Pass Road itself, which the agreement identified by name and by its 1987 book and page number, in a specific carve-out clause. The road, it stated, would remain outside association jurisdiction and governed exclusively by the 1987 easement agreement, recorded at Book 412, page 88. Daniel had read that annexation agreement too, back when he bought the house, filed alongside the 1987 easement in the same lockbox. He assumed, reasonably, that a document stating something in plain English meant what it said. Gordon Blackwell ran for HOA president in the association's June election, a 3-way race against the sitting vice president and a longtime board member, and won by 41 votes to 38 and 31 respectively, a margin that, Daniel would later note wryly to Renata Ibarra, was smaller than the population of Widows Pass Road itself, and might well have gone differently if anyone below the gate had understood what Gordon actually intended to do with the office. He was sworn in on June the 22nd. His first act as president, at his very first regular board meeting on July the 9th, was to introduce Resolution 14, titled Clarification of Association Authority over the Widows Pass Corridor, which reinterpreted a general clause in Article 2, Section 2.1 of the CC&Rs, describing association roads and rights of way, in broad, unremarkable language meant to cover the platted subdivision's own streets, as somehow now encompassing Widows Pass Road as well, on the theory that the 2003 annexation had folded the 5 upper parcels, and by extension, their sole access route, fully into the association's governing authority. 3 board members present that night voted for it. 1. A woman named Carol Whitten, no relation to Daniel despite the near-identical surname, who happened to be an actuary and had a general professional allergy to sloppy contract interpretation, voted against it, and asked, on the record, whether anyone had actually pulled the 2003 annexation agreement and read the carve-out language before drafting the resolution. Gordon told her the language was open to interpretation, and that the board had informal guidance from counsel. The minutes recorded her objection in a single clipped sentence and moved on. The resolution passed 3-1. 2 weeks later, on July the 23rd, Daniel Whitfield received a certified letter informing him that, as road steward, under an agreement the association now considered superseded by subsequent governing action, his continued locking of the gate constituted an ongoing violation of CC&R Section 7.3, obstruction of common access, and that fines of $500 per day would begin accruing if the gate was not left permanently open and unlocked within 14 calendar days of the notice. Daniel wrote back within the week, calm, precise, unhurried, the tone of a man filing a formal engineering objection rather than a personal grievance. He enclosed a certified copy of the 1987 agreement, a certified copy of the 2003 annexation agreement, with the carve-out language highlighted in the same yellow he'd used on the culvert invoice, and a 1-paragraph cover letter noting, politely, that Resolution 14 appeared to exceed the association's documented authority, and that he would be leaving the gate exactly as it had operated for 8 years pending clarification. He heard nothing back for 3 weeks. Then, on August the 6th, the fines started arriving. A new notice every few days, each one a fresh accrual, each one signed by Gordon Blackwell as president. $21,500 over a locked gate that the man's own deed said he had the right to lock, against Daniel Whitfield. "Is this legal where you live?" What would you have done? By September the 4th, Daniel had accumulated $21,500 in daily fines under Section 7.3. On September the 11th, the association mailed him a formal notice of intent to file a lien against Half Moon Ridge if the balance, plus a $200 administrative fee, wasn't resolved within 30 days. Daniel mailed back, again, the same 2 certified documents, along with a second request, written, dated, calm, that the board formally rescind Resolution 14 as exceeding its authority under both the 2003 annexation's carve-out and the CC&R's own amendment procedures. He received, 3 weeks later, a form letter thanking him for his continued input and confirming that the lien process would proceed as scheduled, absent payment. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to imagine Gordon Blackwell as a simple bully who'd bought his way to the top of a mountain and expected the mountain to rearrange itself around him. That's not quite fair to how deliberate it all was. Gordon had, in fact, consulted a lawyer before Resolution 14 ever came to a vote. Ellis Draper, the same business litigator from his dealership days, who billed $420 an hour and had never, in a long career of franchise disputes and floor plan financing arguments, reviewed a mining-era access easement in his life. Draper's memo, later obtained through the discovery process in the lawsuit that followed, advised Gordon that the 2003 annexation's language was ambiguous enough to support a good-faith interpretation favoring association jurisdiction, and that aggressive early enforcement, calibrated to create financial pressure, would likely push Whitfield into a negotiated settlement before he retained his own counsel. It was not, as strategies for other people's mountains go, an insane one. It assumed Daniel Whitfield was the kind of homeowner who folded under a fine notice. It did not account for the fact that Daniel Whitfield had spent 31 years being the person other engineers called when a structure's paperwork didn't match its as-built condition, that he kept a fireproof lockbox with every relevant document inside it, already certified and cross-referenced, and that Colorado's Common Interest Ownership Act required strict compliance with an association's own governing documents before any fine or assessment could ripen into a valid, enforceable lien, meaning that if the board had genuinely exceeded its authority under the CC&Rs, as the 2003 carve-out and the amendment procedure both suggested it had, the lien wasn't something to negotiate down. It was void the moment it was recorded. Daniel didn't share any of that with Gordon directly. He simply kept the gate locked, kept a dated, initialed log of every letter and phone call in the same meticulous style he'd once used logging bridge inspections for the state, and waited to see how far Gordon intended to take it. He did not have to wait long, because Gordon Blackwell was, whatever his legal instincts, a man in a hurry, and a man who had never in his professional life encountered a problem that more pressure couldn't solve. In late September, having failed to move Daniel with fines alone, the board, at Gordon's request, and again on a 3-to-1 vote, with Carol Whitten again dissenting, filed a notice of lien against Half Moon Ridge for the accumulated Section 7.3 violations, now standing at $31,000, plus the association's attorney fees of $2,200 for Draper's time drafting the filing, plus a brand new special assessment of $18,750 that Gordon had pushed through the very same board meeting, styled as a Road Corridor Improvement Fund, intended to pave Widows Pass Road from gravel to asphalt over its full length, a project that would benefit almost exclusively Falcon's Nest and, not coincidentally, would have made possible the kind of heavier equipment traffic a paved surface could support that a gravel mountain road could not. The lien, once recorded with the county, attached itself to Daniel Whitfield's property title the way liens do, quietly, publicly, permanently visible to anyone who ran a title search. It surfaced painfully 3 weeks later, in October, when Daniel's daughter Rebecca, house hunting in Denver with her fiancé for their first place together, asked her father to co-sign a modest gift letter loan to help with the down payment, and the loan officer processing the paperwork flagged an outstanding $33,000 lien against the only significant asset in Daniel's name. Daniel had spent his entire career making sure other people's bridges didn't fail under unexpected load. He had not expected the load to land, of all places, on his own daughter's mortgage application, in the form of a phone call from Rebecca asking, carefully, gently, whether everything was okay. "Dad, is there something you haven't told me?" It got worse before it got better, in the specific, humiliating way these things do in a town small enough that public record travels roughly as fast as gossip, and often through the same people. At the Timberline Ridge 4th of July potluck the following summer, postponed a week that year for a hailstorm, 3 separate neighbors, none of whom had bothered to actually look up the underlying documents, approached Daniel with expressions of gentle, performative concern to ask whether it was true he was blocking the fire department from reaching the ridge, a rumor that had apparently started at Melissa Blackwell's book club and traveled from there with the particular speed rumors travel when they're more interesting than the truth. It was not true. The 1987 agreement guaranteed emergency vehicle access at all times, gate or no gate, and Daniel had, years earlier, mounted a keyed lockbox on the gate post for the Ashford Peak Fire Protection District, specifically so that no engine crew would ever be delayed by a padlock, a fact the district's own chief, when asked directly by a Denver television reporter months later, confirmed on camera without hesitation. But a rumor doesn't check its citations before it spreads, and Daniel spent that potluck explaining himself, calmly, to people who had already half decided what kind of neighbor he must be. 2 of the other easement-holding households, the Osei family at Lot 12 and the Faribaus at Lot 13, began quietly avoiding him at the mailbox kiosk, uncertain which side of a messy HOA dispute was the safe one to be seen standing on, particularly with an $18,000 special assessment now arriving in their own mailboxes as well, an assessment they had no meaningful ability to contest without hiring their own attorney, and which several other households simply paid, grudgingly, to make the discomfort go away. Gordon, for his part, took to describing Daniel at board meetings as a disgruntled homeowner attempting to hold the entire mountain hostage over a personal grudge with an outdated piece of paper, a phrase that made it, nearly verbatim, into the official minutes of the September meeting. Minutes Daniel later obtained through a formal records request and read 3 times, slowly, at his kitchen table, the same table where the fireproof lockbox usually sat closed, before deciding it was finally time to stop absorbing the cost of this quietly. $31,000 in fines and a lien on his home, against Daniel Whitfield. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done? The fight back, when it started, did not look like a lawsuit. It looked like a Tuesday afternoon in late October at the Larimer County Clerk and Recorder's office, 40 minutes down the highway from Ashford Peak, where Daniel spent 3 hours at a public terminal, pulling every document that had ever touched Widows Pass Road, Lot 41, and the Timberline Ridge annexation, and paid to have each one certified, one, by a clerk who seemed mildly amused by how thoroughly he was cross-referencing book and page numbers he clearly already had memorized. What he laid out on his dining room table that evening, next to a pot of coffee that went cold before he finished, was cleaner than even he had expected. The 1987 Easement Agreement, Book 412, page 88, unambiguous on every relevant point. Fee title to the roadbed in the Lot 41 owner, gate authority explicit, 24-hour notice requirement for heavy vehicles explicit, emergency access guaranteed regardless. The 2003 Annexation Agreement, Book 1140, page 233, its carve-out language word for word, exactly what he remembered. Widows Pass Road, outside association jurisdiction, and governed exclusively by the 1987 agreement, a sentence Resolution 14 had simply pretended did not exist. And the CC&Rs themselves, Article 9, Section 9.4, plainly requiring any amendment or reinterpretation of the association's jurisdictional boundaries to pass by a 2/3 vote of the full membership at a properly noticed special meeting, not by a simple 3-to-1 board resolution passed at a regular monthly session attended by 14 homeowners out of 45 eligible. Resolution 14, in other words, hadn't just been wrong on the merits. It had been procedurally void from the moment the gavel came down. Daniel's next call, the following morning, was to Renata Ibarra, a real estate and HOA litigation attorney in Fort Collins, who had spent 11 years representing homeowners against overreaching boards across northern Colorado, and who, according to 3 separate reviews Daniel had read before calling, did not lose often. Renata took one look at the 1987 agreement, the annexation's carve-out, and the CC&R amendment requirement, faxed over that same afternoon, then followed by certified originals by mail, and told Daniel, flatly, over a recorded call he'd asked her permission to keep for his own log, that the lien wasn't merely unenforceable. It was, in her professional opinion, a strong candidate for a slander of title claim, given that the association had been shown the contrary documents in writing, twice, months before ever filing the lien, and had filed it anyway. They didn't misunderstand the road, Renata told him. They saw the 2003 carve-out and decided to file the lien regardless. That's not a good faith mistake, Daniel. That's a paper trail. Renata drafted a formal demand letter sent by certified mail on November the 9th, giving the association 30 days to release the lien in full, formally rescind Resolution 14, and refund the special assessment collected from lots 10 through 14, or face a civil suit for slander of title, breach of fiduciary duty against the board, and a claim for attorney's fees under the Colorado statute governing improperly recorded HOA liens. Daniel just made a critical move, hiring a lawyer and sending a formal demand instead of quietly paying the lien to make the whole thing disappear. Was that the right call? What's your strategy? Gordon Blackwell's response to the demand letter was not, as Renata had half expected, a quiet release of the lien to avoid the expense and exposure of a lawsuit. It was a special board meeting, called for late November. Agenda Item 1, Update on Widows Pass Corridor Enforcement. Daniel attended, as was his right as a dues-paying member under the limited annexation. So did, for the first time in this entire saga, roughly 24 other homeowners from the platted subdivision below, people who had started hearing enough disconnected fragments of the story, a lien, a lawsuit threat, an $18,000 assessment nobody quite remembered voting to authorize, to want to hear it laid out properly, in person, rather than second-hand at the mailbox kiosk. Gordon opened the meeting with a prepared statement accusing Daniel of weaponizing legal technicalities to deny the community access it is rightfully entitled to, a line that visibly irritated at least 3 homeowners in the back row, one of whom, a retired schoolteacher named Priya Nair, not an easement holder herself, just a long-time resident of Aspen Hollow Lane with a low tolerance for imprecision, raised her hand and asked, simply, whether anyone on the board had actually read the full text of the 2003 annexation agreement before drafting Resolution 14. Gordon said the board had relied on legal counsel. Someone asked which counsel. Gordon said Ellis Draper. Someone else, a homeowner who happened to work as a paralegal at a firm in Loveland, asked, not unkindly, whether Mr. Draper had any background in real estate or common interest community law specifically. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the official minutes, later obtained by Daniel through another records request, simply noted, discussion continued. It was at this meeting that Daniel Whitfield, who had spent 4 months quietly documenting and recording and building a case rather than shouting about it, finally stood up and spoke at length. He thanked the board for the opportunity and then read, calmly, without raising his voice, in the same unhurried, load-bearing tone he'd once used presenting structural findings to county commissioners, the exact carve-out language from the 2003 annexation, the exact amendment requirement from Article 9 of the CC&Rs, and the total dollar figure now improperly assessed, $58,200 in fines and lien claims against him personally, plus the $18,750 special assessment, spread across 4 other households who owned property the association had no documented jurisdiction over in the first place. The room, by the account of at least 6 homeowners Daniel spoke with afterward, went very quiet. Gordon Blackwell adjourned the meeting 9 minutes later, without calling a vote on anything on the agenda. 2 days after that meeting, the Ashford Peak Sentinel, a twice-weekly paper that mostly covered high school volleyball scores and county water rights disputes, ran a 400-word item under the headline, Mountain Road Dispute Divides Timberline Ridge HOA, after a homeowner who'd attended the meeting called the editor directly to describe it. It wasn't investigative journalism. It was a short, factual summary. A road, an easement, a lien, an attorney's letter. But Ashford Peak was small enough, and Larimer County's real estate circles smaller still, that within a week, the item had been clipped and passed around enough that a Denver television station's consumer affairs reporter, scrolling small regional papers for segment ideas, called Renata Ibarra's office, asking whether Daniel would be willing to talk on camera about the neighbor who tried to buy his way onto a road he didn't own. Daniel, after a long conversation with Renata about exactly what he would and would not say on the record, agreed to a short interview. No dramatics, no editorializing, just the documents laid out plainly on his kitchen table and a level explanation, in his own words, of what a recorded easement actually means and doesn't mean. It ran on a Thursday evening broadcast, 90 seconds long, calm and almost dry in tone, and by Friday morning, the clip had circulated widely enough within Larimer County's real estate community that Gordon's own agent, Court Ferris, the same young agent who'd sold him Falcon's Nest and mentioned the access situation almost as an afterthought during the original walkthrough, called Gordon directly to ask, with visible discomfort, whether any of this was going to complicate a future resale. It was around this time, in mid-November, with a lawsuit now formally filed by Renata on Daniel's behalf in Larimer County District Court, seeking release of the lien, a declaratory judgment on the association's total lack of jurisdiction over Widow's Pass Road and damages for slander of title, that the Osei family and the Faribaus, the 2 other easement-holding households who'd been quietly paying the disputed special assessment out of a wish to just stay out of it, finally sat down with Daniel over coffee at his kitchen table and asked to see the underlying documents for themselves. Kwame Osei, an actuary by profession, a man who spent his working life checking other people's math for a living, read through the 1987 agreement twice, cover to cover, and said, with the specific flat disbelief of someone who does not encounter sloppy contract logic often, they just decided the carve-out didn't apply. They didn't even try to argue that it wasn't there. They just skipped over it. The 4 households above the gate, Daniel, the Oseias, the Faribaus, and the absentee owner of Lot 11, a software consultant in Austin who rented the property out most of the year and had been paying the assessment without ever noticing it, filed a joint records request under the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, demanding the association's complete financial and meeting records for the preceding 3 years, a request the board was legally obligated to fulfill within a set statutory window. What arrived, in a cardboard box delivered to Daniel's porch in early December, included something none of them had specifically been searching for: minutes from a closed-session board discussion held in late June, weeks before Resolution 14 was even drafted, in which Gordon Blackwell had first proposed the road paving special assessment, explaining to the board, in his own recorded words as transcribed by the association's part-time administrator, that the current gravel surface is inadequate to support the driveway and access improvements planned at Falcon's Nest, including the heliport pad, a project Daniel had never known Gordon was even contemplating, and one that would have required, under both Colorado aeronautics regulations and county land use code, a use permit the association had no conceivable authority to grant on a road it did not own and had never owned. Daniel just made a critical move, pulling the association's closed session minutes and finding out the road paving assessment existed to build a private heliport pad. Was that the right call? What's your strategy? The lawsuit moved faster than even Daniel had expected, largely because Renata's motion for summary judgment on the narrow jurisdictional question was, in the words of the presiding judge at the January hearing, about as close to undisputed as these things get in this courtroom. The 2003 annexation agreement said what it said, in plain and unambiguous language. The CC&R amendment procedure required a 2/3 membership vote at a properly noticed special meeting, a vote that had simply never been held. Resolution 14 was void from the moment it passed, which meant, as a matter of straightforward legal consequence, that every fine, every lien, and every dollar of the special assessment built on top of it was void as well. Judge Alicia Herrera, in a written order issued January the 29th, released the lien on Half Moon Ridge in full, declared Resolution 14 ultra vires, beyond the scope of the association's lawful authority, and ordered the Timberline Ridge Homeowners Association to refund the $18,750 in improperly assessed road funds to the 4 affected households within 30 days. She reserved ruling on the slander of title claim and the request for attorney's fees for a separate hearing scheduled the following month, but included, almost as an aside near the end of her written order, one line, the Ashford Peak Sentinel reprinted in full, that the board's conduct, undertaken with apparent knowledge of the very document that foreclosed its claimed authority, raises serious questions about the good faith of the association's leadership that this court expects the membership itself to address through its own governance processes. The membership addressed it 3 weeks later, at an emergency recall meeting called under the CC&R's own removal provision, after a petition signed by 29 of the 45 eligible households, comfortably above the 2/3 threshold required to force the issue, demanded a formal vote on removing Gordon Blackwell as president. The meeting was held on a Saturday morning in mid-February in the community clubhouse, standing room only. 41 members present, in person or by proxy, more than had turned out for any single HOA meeting in the subdivision's 26-year history. Folding chairs pulled in from the storage closet to seat the overflow. Gordon spoke first, and to his credit did not attempt to relitigate the jurisdictional question, which by that point even his own counsel had quietly conceded in a court filing. He argued instead that he had been acting in good faith to improve shared community infrastructure, that the heliport reference in the closed session minutes had been preliminary, exploratory, and never formally advanced, and that removing him now, mid-term, over what he characterized as a legal dispute open to reasonable interpretation, would be an overreaction the community would come to regret. Priya Nair stood, and without editorial comment, read aloud the exact closed session minutes describing the heliport pad, followed by the exact language of Ellis Draper's memo, advising that aggressive early enforcement, calibrated to create financial pressure against Whitfield, would likely force a settlement before he retained counsel of his own, a memo Renata had obtained through a separate discovery order after arguing it went directly to the question of the board's good faith. The room, once again, went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a story everyone has been half-hearing for months suddenly resolves into something specific, documented, and impossible to argue away. The recall vote passed 34-7. Gordon Blackwell was removed as president of the Timberline Ridge Homeowners Association, effective immediately, replaced on an interim basis by the sitting vice president, a semi-retired civil contractor named Harold Fenn, who had voted against Resolution 14 from the very beginning. Within his first month in office, Harold moved to formally amend the CC&Rs to state, explicitly and beyond any future misreading, that Widows Pass Road and its 5 upper parcels remained governed solely and exclusively by the 1987 easement agreement, and fell outside the association's jurisdiction for any purpose whatsoever beyond the narrow original snow removal and group insurance provisions of the 2003 annexation, a clarifying amendment that passed, this time, by the proper 2/3 membership vote, with room to spare. After everything Daniel went through, was it worth it? Have you fought your HOA, won or walked away? Tell me your story. The February hearing on damages and attorney's fees, held 3 weeks after the recall vote, was almost anticlimactic by comparison to everything that had preceded it. Judge Herrera found that the association's filing of the lien, after having been shown the 2003 carve-out language in writing on 2 separate occasions months earlier, met Colorado's legal standard for a claim brought in bad faith, and awarded Daniel Whitfield $11,400 in damages for slander of title, plus his full attorney's fees of $19,600, both payable by the association, a cost that, under the association's own governing structure, would ultimately be spread across the general membership's annual dues rather than assessed against Gordon Blackwell personally, a detail that struck more than one homeowner at the following month's meeting as its own small, useful lesson in exactly why boards exist to be checked by their membership rather than trusted blindly between elections. The $4,100 culvert repair Daniel had been billed for back in April was reimbursed in full as part of the broader settlement, with interest calculated from the original invoice date. The $18,750 special assessment was refunded to the 4 upper households, the Osei family using theirs, with some quiet satisfaction, to finally reseal their own long-neglected driveway that spring. Gordon Blackwell did not run for the board again. He also, according to Court Ferris, who helped him list Falcon's Nest 14 months after he'd bought it, took a loss of just under $300,000 on the eventual sale, a fact that made its way through the community with considerably less sympathy than the schoolteacher's fire department rumor had ever generated on Daniel's behalf. By spring, Widows Pass Road looked almost exactly as it had before any of it started. Gravel, narrow, climbing in patient switchbacks toward 5 houses above a locked green gate, the same padlock Daniel had installed back in 2013. What had changed was smaller in appearance, and, in its way, considerably more permanent. The 1987 agreement now carried a formal recorded addendum, signed by all 5 upper parcel owners together with the association's new leadership, restating in explicit, future-proof language exactly what a board could and could not claim about the road, closing off precisely the ambiguity Gordon Blackwell had once tried to drive a heliport pad through. The Osei family and the Faribaug's, who had spent months avoiding Daniel at the mailbox kiosk out of a quiet fear of picking the wrong side of an ugly dispute, now stopped by Half Moon Ridge, often enough that Daniel had started keeping a second folding chair on the porch, and a third, eventually, for whichever Osei kid tagged along. His daughter Rebecca's loan officer notified that the lien had been released in full, processed the gift letter paperwork without further comment, and Rebecca and her fiancé closed on their first house in Denver that June. Daniel kept his log of the entire affair, every letter, every recorded call, every certified document, in the same fireproof lockbox where he'd once kept nothing but a deed, a death certificate, and a copy of a 1987 agreement he'd read twice before ever signing anything of his own. He figured at this point it was probably worth reading twice more, and started, out of something between habit and hard-earned caution, actually recommending to the Oseas and the Farabaus that they keep certified copies of their own now too. He still locks the gate every night at 9. He still gives 24 hours notice, in writing, for anything over £10,000, and expects exactly the same in return, precisely as the agreement has always required, no more and no less. Nobody at Falcon's Nest, under its new owners, a quiet retired couple from Scottsdale, who called ahead before their first moving truck ever left the highway, has ever had to ask him to unlock it. If you've ever been fined for something you had every legal right to do, if you've ever watched a board rewrite the rules mid-game and dare you to prove otherwise, you already know the particular, patient feeling that got Daniel Whitfield through the last 11 months of his life. Subscribe to HOA Horror Files for the next story of a homeowner who read the fine print nobody thought they'd bother reading. And tell me in the comments, would you have locked the gate?